And lots of conversations get very focused about, managing the moose. We need a moose management conversation. We need a, predator management conversation. We need a water management plan, and we came at it from a very different point of view, saying, in fact, we need to manage people and how they interact with our territory.
Welcome to the Co-Management Commons podcast. My name is Jamie Snook. I am your podcast host, and I have been working in and with Indigenous communities for over 20 years now. I am joined in this podcast by some of the leading practitioners, researchers, elders, and community members from this sector, where we discuss co-management in Canada with Indigenous peoples from coast to coast to coast. Please check out the show notes, where we always share lots of other resources. And in between episodes, your feedback is always encouraged and appreciated. So thank you very much once again, and take care.
Yeah, I was going to kick him out of the territory. I was like, son, it was crazy, yeah.
Well, Sue, that's a really great way to start our podcast today on the Co-Management Commons podcast. Thank you for not kicking Dennis out of the territory.
Yeah. He didn't listen.
He didn't listen in the beginning? What did it take to bring him around?
I was just a kid, angry at the world, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's really a pleasure to have both of you take the time to come on this podcast. It's all about co-management in Canada, coast to coast to coast. And I know when I first started to learn about co-management, everything I was reading was seemed to be based in the Yukon, and obviously it's been happening there from a very long time now. And when I seen your bios that Carrie put together, I knew right away I was going to meet people today that have probably seen it all and have been involved and in the trenches and really co-management practitioners. So, and what I like to do usually at the beginning of these is just for people to introduce themselves in a good way, so listeners can learn a little bit more about who we are on the podcast today. We can start with you, Sue.
T'akhu Â Tlén, like it's a long way. I'm a long ways from home right now. My name is T'akhu Â Tlén. It means woman who talks lots and tells a true story. I belong to the Tlingit clan, and I am a woman who loves land and who loves people. I have a special affection for the Taku River Tlingits and my ancestors, and our generated new generations. I just feel really excited about an opportunity to tell you about who the Taku River Tlingits have been in relation to this conservation conversation. I have been involved in it since the late 90s, and I have had the privilege of serving as treaty negotiator, lead negotiator, chief negotiator. I also helped Taku negotiate our G2G agreements for land, strategic land protection. Many years ago now that we completed those agreements, I sat on the joint management group for that for, 5 or 6 years. I more recently led the work for the Tlingit Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas Initiative. Left that post a couple of years ago. And I just am completely committed to having our land loved in a way that supports Tlingit way of life. And, the best news I've had in the last 10 years happened just the other day. My brother Wayne caught a king salmon in Tlén Lake. In Tlén Lake. And my daddy's favorite salmon is the white king. And it was a white king salmon that was in his net. And so it's like we're all getting to witness a miracle, that the work and the things we've been doing are making a difference. And that to me is like the juice, the thing that helps me get up in the morning, that helps me want to still be in the trenches of land love and helping others know how to love our land. It feels like if people could connect with the places in our territory that we love so dearly, they will show up more loving in the world. I just know that's the truth. And so I feel really blessed that I've served on the board for T'akhu Â Tlén Conservancy. I was in the joint clan meeting when we started the T'akhu Â Tlén Conservancy, and I've been involved peripherally all the way along, but also I took on a board member appointment from the joint clan meeting, I think in 2009. But it's been a while, and I really love the people that I get to work with, the issues that come to our table, and the creative ways that we have found to meaningfully support good work in our community. So I'm just really glad to be here today. Thanks so much.
No, thank you. And I really don't envy Dennis having to introduce himself after that beautiful introduction. And that was really good. But Dennis, I know you have a really great story as well. Please introduce yourself.
Well, yeah, again, just like I said, thank you so much. I mean, I have many names that I've gathered over the different relationships I've had with people. Shawnee-Each is my name with the Taku River Tlingit, which means sugar daddy, or actually it means sweet snow daddy. But I mean, it's almost a relationship just between Sue and I. I almost died on the Taku River, basically in an airplane accident. And Sue was with me, and she prayed beside me when I was in the water. We put me in the cold water to slow the bleed. I was bleeding out, and she prayed to everybody that would listen. I think that is the foundation of a lot of our commitment together to see this through. That was in 1999, I recall. We were putting together a big donor meeting of people to, put together some money to make this work together. And it worked. We did it. And I would actually, I don't know if I would go to that extremes again to make something work. but anyway, it did work that time. But really with the, as far as introduction to myself, I was blessed to grow up in Wyoming with a family that spent most of the time out. And then my early experiences, with my education was all about wildlife ecology, but it never really discussed anything about working with communities, Indigenous knowledge, conservation ecology. All those different terms were not part of the curriculum then. But in the early 80s, I did work with the Blackfeet in northern Montana and their relatives to the north in Alberta. And that's really the first experiences I had with, if you're actually going to get something done, then that's where you have to start. And I spent several years on the BC coast, which is about, what became the Great Barrier Rainforest game, which is where I was introduced, to people related to the T'akhu River Tlingit, which is what brought me up there. But really it was a long-term relationship with T'akhu River Tlingit about what is indeed management. What is it indeed about caring for the land? I actually dislike the word co-management shared management, and all that kind of stuff. It should be just management. These are people these are their lands, and they should be taking care of them. They know how to take care of them, so let them do it. And we've struggled, the agreement we finally did with the Taku Tlingit, it's 20-something years old now, and we ended up on shared decision-making, which is, in the day, it was good, but it has a long way to go. But Canada has led this development so much. Like I mentioned before, I just returned from the country of Botswana, where we're dealing with this kind of similar kind of, situation with some tribal people wanting to take control of their lands. Canada comes up all the time. Canada is the example, along with Australia, and also New Zealand. It's pushing, and I wish it could push, just even further. I owe so much to my years, with Sue and her people for just teaching me how to do this. So, yeah.
Nice. No, that's a powerful story too. And I can see now why you're both so close on this call and wanting to reconnect for sure. And I was going to
I
congratulate.
just want to add one thing and clarify something. Like Dennis mentioned about me praying beside him. At that point in my life, I had lost a daughter the year before in a real tragic way, 2 years before. And I hadn't spoken to God or wanted anything to do with him in that whole 2 years. And when I saw Dennis laying in the water, and we didn't put him in the water to slow the bleeding, we actually hauled you up on the shore. And I remember running to you. There was no Band-Aids big enough, And I was running towards Dennis, taking my jacket off, and I knew we needed to get the bleeding under control. And so I'd gone into him, like right into here on his body, and I was pressing my knee in and hollering at Richard, and Bruce was there. Like, we got to get this bleeding under control. Somebody call a fucking chopper, and like all this stuff was going on. And I got up from there when someone took over the controlling the bleeding thing, like I had my knee right into his arm. And Richard came in to take over. Like, I was exhausted. I don't know how long that was, a few minutes. And when I walked away from Dennis, and there's a big rock wall right across the river, and it was like this darkness was just coming. I could feel death coming to get Dennis. And I dropped to my knees and I started talking to God. And I demanded a miracle. And I thought God owed me that. And so I demanded a miracle for Dennis. And then a chopper showed up and he was flown to Whitehorse. And then a medevac from SeaTac, Seattle came, the best trauma hospital around. And Dennis was flown from Whitehorse right to the trauma surgeons in Seattle. And all of those things took miracles to happen. And so every time I see Dennis, I am reminded that our God performs miracles in a real, regular way. And I've taken that belief into all of the work that I do. And I am so grateful to you, Dennis. I'm so grateful to God. Like, there's no way you and me are both still here, dedicated to this work, without the love of God in our hearts. And so I just really needed to say that.
No, thank you. And maybe, Sue, we could ask you to continue on a bit with that and how after that initial trauma and Dennis was out of the woods, so to speak. It was a pretty emotional story, and it's a miracle that I'm getting to meet you today, Dennis. So how did you guys pick up your relationship after that and start this work with T'akhu Â Tlén Conservancy? TAC.
Well, I'll tell you, that day when the chopper left with Dennis, my next call was to the spokesperson at the time. His name's John Ward. And I said, what do I do? Like, there was still 2 more planes of people waiting in Athlone to come. We were the first plane trip in. And so Scott and John and, the funders, they were all coming still. And Uncle John said, And he's my uncle. He said, well, sweetheart, it's your call. We can shut this thing down right now and you all come home, or we keep going. What's it going to be, Sue? And I said, well, we have to keep going. Like Dennis would want us to keep going. There's no way we can stop now. Like, yeah, he's getting medical attention and all of that stuff is being taken care of. He would want us to keep going with the work. And so we did. And we continued with the meetings. The planes came in. We did all the things. And from that first meeting of us all, many, many more things happened and many, many more conversations happened. I think it was a couple years before Dennis made his way back to the river. And then I went in on that trip with him too, and we all went right back to the spot where it happened. And we had ceremony and we had prayer together. And we left the hurt there, at that spot. Our land could keep it. We didn't have to carry it anymore. And we had work to do. Like we were clear there was still work to do. And so, from then, like one of the most important things that I learned from my elders, I was always involved in the land claims discussion and treaty making and all of that from when I was I think I took my first real job in the land claims office as a student when I was 17 years old. And so I'd been exposed to all of these teachings and evidence that the Taku River Tlingits own this territory and we were responsible for it. And at the time, back then they said that treaties could only return 5% of our lands to us. That was an old NDP policy or somebody's policy way back then, that we would only get 5%, no more than 5% of our territory. And our elders said, okay, if that's the issue, then we're not ready to make an agreement. What we need to do is create a land protection plan that the agreement can rest on, that will protect our rights and title, that will protect our land and water. And we need to protect our land and then worry about what the Tlingits need. We're going to first protect the land and water for the wildlife, for the salmon, for water, the quality of water. The elders came at it like, what will we absolutely need in 100 years, in 200 years, in 300 years? And it was water. It was water. And so how do you protect a landscape as big as the T'akhu watershed and the headwaters of the Yukon River? How do you protect the water in that expansive part of our world? How you protect water is you protect the land it lives on. And so that's the agenda we've come into every conversation with, is how do we protect the water so the water will always be there for all of us, but especially for our family, the beavers, the moose, the bears, the caribou, the frogs, the bugs, like all those things. How do we protect all of that on the landscape in the face of all these? Our whole territory was staked at the time, the whole thing. Anywhere that there was even maybe gold, it was staked. And so at that time, we had to avoid the staked areas. And, it was a really different world when we were starting the how do you protect our homeland conversation. And so we came at it with science and with Indigenous knowings, and really our work was to combine the Western worldview and our worldview and figure out, how do we spatially understand first what needs to be protected and then figure out the rules for how we manage people in relation to those places? And lots of conversations get very focused about, managing the moose. We need a moose management conversation. We need a predator management conversation. We need a water management plan, and we came at it from a very different point of view, saying, in fact, we need to manage people and how they interact with our territory in relation to all of these resources. And our territory is so wealthy with so many things, living things and things that aren't alive. Gold, copper, lead, zinc, all of those materials that people want from our territory. In the face of all that, how do we protect Tlingit way of life? How do we protect water? How do we make sure there's economic benefits and livelihoods and people can actually be happy in our territory? And so with those kind of, pillars of like the holding posts or the fence posts or however we think about it, with those priorities in place, how do we actually write things that make sense, that inspire people to do the right thing, and that will actually result in protection for the water and for the land and for the people? And so that's kind of been the quest this whole time, how do we support? And then very quickly after going into those conversations, 25 years ago, conservation organizations were dealing with, well, we helped, Indigenous people here, and then economics took over and they logged the valleys we protected. Like, how are we going to? Conservationists were concerned that we weren't really conservationists. And we were concerned that the conservationists, were going to shut down our way of life. Like they would try to protect so much of everything that pretty soon Tlingits would be restricted from living a Tlingit way of life. And so we both came into this process with those fears. We couldn't trust each other. How would we do this? Who would be in charge and, all of that stuff. And so we also got very clear that we needed the Tlingit government couldn't be the conservation organization. They have the economics, the social well-being, all the other questions to wrestle with. We got really clear that we needed a Tlingit conservation organization. And it had to be separate from our government, and it had to be separate from the conservation organizations. It had to be a Tlingit thing unto itself. And the conservation organizations, I don't know if it's acquiesced or respected. We Tlingits needed the majority of seats on that board, and we needed the conservation voice there too. And so the T'akhu Â Tlén Conservancy was born. The idea of it, the need for it was really clear. And when we brought the idea to the community, that's like, there are so many moments when I'm so proud of my people. But when we brought that question to the joint clan meeting, they were like, yeah, get to work, write that down, bring it back to us in a few months, and we're going to do this. And then we were so shocked how easy it was. It was like, okay, now you know what? We're looking at each other like, okay, who's going to do this? Like, we didn't think it was going to be that easy, to get the direction to do it. And so then we got the direction to do it. And maybe I'll let Dennis talk for a while because I could talk all day.
Well, I think it'd be really interesting to hear Dennis's perspective and how he's seen it unfold or now, because you've told a beautiful narrative of how you've seen it firsthand, Dennis. Do you see it all the same way, or please share how it all evolved for you?
Well, yeah, actually, it was very nice to hear Sue that, say that, listen to that, because it just reaffirms everything we've done so much. This was a while ago. Look at it. It's, again, back to my first experience in the Great Bear Rainforest in 93, when I first met with the foundation in the U.S. about starting that work. He said, "You're going to waste my money and your time, basically working with Indians. You can't do this." And that was proven wrong. And that really spilled over to the, over to the work in, at Taku River Tlingit. And one of the first people with me working in Atlan, Sue mentioned him before, Bruce Basil. He's a Quaker. And he said, he always said, that ultimately all governments are corrupt. and cannot be trusted. And so that's really the birth of nonprofits and NGOs, and just as a watchdog on the outside, seeing what's going on. And it doesn't matter if it's an Indigenous government, but particularly with Indigenous governments, because they've been corrupted themselves by the dominant government to have an elected thing that's not associated with their original traditional system. So, but anyway, it's just you need an outside voice. You need somebody just saying, wait a minute. We went through a long-term, several years, negotiating the Taku River Tlingit land plan agreement. And the government said, that they would be wonderfully happy to allow the Taku River Tlingit to have an involvement with government, but they can't afford it. And that's indeed where we started to put together the idea of a separate fund to help with that long-term management. And by having that fund, yes, the Tlingit can afford to do this. They can, be involved. And so why not? So the establishment of the Klatsini Fund, which is part of the T'akhu Â Tlén Conservancy, was a real game changer in those discussions. There was all of a sudden money that was available, and indeed, with talk of the government, unfortunately, it's very difficult to talk about ethics, but talking about money, it gets really quite simple. You can either do it or not. And, so there was a capability proven, that was there. And so by creating the T'akhu Â Tlén Conservancy, there was a demonstrated ability for the Taku River Tlingit to be involved in the longer term management of that area. And really the evolution of how the entity of the Taku River Conservancy was evolved was, again, it gets back to trust. It's always trust, right? And so we're going to put up this amount of money, will the Tlingit be conservationally minded, or will they go the other direction? When we first started working in the community, 50% was for a mine and a road, and the other 50% were not. It was back and forth, So the creation of a conservation-minded organization was imperative for the people putting money into this endeavor. It is a conservation organization, the T'akhu Â Tlén Conservancy. That's its mission, and its goal is to promote conservation, primarily. The first time I walked through the Taku River Tlingit office to meet with the leadership, I was sidetracked by an old woman who brought me into this little room with a bunch of other old women, old elders, who they wanted to talk about my mother. That was my first question. They said, "Who is your mother?" I said, "Margie." And they asked me questions about my relationship with Margie, my mom. And what did Margie think about me being there? And what was my role there? And what was impressed on me, they basically said, as a decision that goes against the land will never be approved by the elders if the elders have a respected voice within the community. And they agreed. And after we got done talking, they agreed that I could go meet with quote, with the leadership. I knew that I had already met with the leadership, and I was going to go now talk with the elected leaders. And that, that's really the crux of, I think, what we're trying to do with the T'akhu Â Tlén Conservancy is to respect those old voices. And it's hard. It does get difficult with all the different kind of dynamics that goes within a small community. But it's really listening to the land and listening to the people that are closest to the land. I think what we're trying to do.
You are listening to a special Yukon edition of the Co-Management Commons podcast supported by Yukon University and UArctic. The podcast is produced by Cloudberry Connections and hosted by Jamie Snook in collaboration with Kiri Staples and David Silas. Enjoy the rest of the conversation, and thank you for caring about Indigenous co-management and honoring our treaties.
Well, I would just congratulate you both and everybody involved, and the fact that you just had a 20-year anniversary of TAC is something to be celebrated, and it shows a lot of endurance. And I know at the beginning, Sue, you joked about not kicking Dennis out of town, but like on a more serious note, what do you think made things work over such an endearing period of time, 20 years? No doubt there were a lot of difficult conversations along the way, but something special has happened for you to be able to tell that story you did in the beginning about catching that king salmon recently.
Yeah, the endurance, I don't know much about that. What I do know about is that, our elders, like right in the thick of all of this, there was a project called the T'akhu Chief Project, and they were trying to reopen a mine that had been closed in the late 50s. And they were planning to build a road through key parts of the territory into the T'akhu watershed. And our elders had signed a declaration saying no road into the T'akhu, not ever. And so they put me in a position as a project committee member and said, go stop the road. I'd been the secretary up to that point. And, politics in Tlingit territory were really volatile back then because there was a split in our community, but our elders' voice stayed really stable and really strong about no road, and protect for future generations, protect the water. And there were so many complicated things about that mine and about the process and about constructing a road through. We went to the Supreme Court of Canada to get that project stopped. And that's not what happened, And so all of that happened. And during those times, like I could see, like if I had an image, it would be Sue and Dennis, the conservation groups and the Tlingit standing back to back, trying to protect the land that we were learning to love, And as a young person, having substantial land-loving people watching my back while I went into those fights is what made it possible to walk into every single one of those meeting rooms. Sometimes I was in project committee meetings for a week-long, 12-hour days, like just slogging, to make sure we were consulted and to make sure that our concerns were addressed. And what happened was the project was approved and not by the Tlingits. It was approved by the province. The Tlingits were not giving their approval. And so we continued to massage and maneuver and create agreements. And it wasn't really, and still I wonder, there are still people who want to build a road into that valley, And so we're not out of the woods yet. It's still going to take some persevering and protecting and respecting each other and loving our land and caring for people to make this thing real. We're not out of the woods yet in protecting the T'akhu.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Dennis.
No, I was just going to say, and just some context about the Taku River itself, and just internationally. It's the largest functioning, unroaded, intact salmon system left in North America.
All 5 species.
Yeah, there's 3,300 kilometers of salmon-bearing rivers in the 5 million acres that make up the T'akhu. No place else in the world has that kind of intactness and beauty and everything. Everybody's home. All the original species are there and doing quite well, thank you. From grizzly bears to wolverines to everything else. And all this work is about is having the Tlingit have an involvement in that watershed as well. at a place. It doesn't exist anywhere else. I mentioned my work in Botswana. The Okavango Delta is about the same size as the Taku River Tlingit area. There are 120 tourist lodges in the Okavango Delta. Imagine, and roads and people flying in and out, kind of stuff, whatever. But in the Taku, there's nothing. It's there. And the world needs to support that place for being what it is. It's unusual. It's incredible. It's the only place left. One of the few places left.
That was brings me to a question I was hoping to learn a bit about today. And I guess just last year there was an Indigenous protected area declared, and like how does that all intersect with the Conservancy and the work that you're doing? Was this group also a part of that declaration, or what's your thoughts on that? And does that give you hope going forward? Or
For sure.
Yeah. There was a lot of time spent with talking with Indigenous holders within the community, and just about important areas within the greater TRT territory. And there was a wonderful map created called the Klatsini Vision, where people just said this is what has to be protected for the people to continue to exist as a people. And during the initial land planning with the BC government, we fell short of that vision. But it was a good chunk of it. It wasn't that bad. And what the Indigenous Protected this IPCA, indeed, there's an opportunity to encapsulate that whole vision of the Klatsini. And that's the hope, with indeed the necessary monetary funding to manage that area as a people. So that's the hope. Sorry, Sue, go ahead.
Yeah. One of the other map pieces that we created as part of the work was really I remember asking like Dennis and, other scientists I work with, Mark and Kim, the women who were on the people who were on the front lines providing technical tools, for us to go into all these meetings with and stuff. And I wanted to, we had a moose habitat map, we had a sheep habitat map, we had a, where the woodpeckers lived map, we had all these maps. And I was like, I want a Tlingit habitat map. A Tlingit woman needs at least 3 moose a year to live happily. She needs this many grouse. She needs this many ducks. She needs these harvested materials. She needs these medicines. How do we map that? And they did. They came up with a map, a Tlingit habitat map. And that became the basis of the map that Dennis is talking about, the Klatsini map. And so, the more we were able to document and understand what mattered to Tlingits, that clarified what our work was going to be about, And so to this day, those map tools that we developed, 10, 15, 20 years ago are still the foundation, Elder Dennis, I was just going to say, like Dennis said, trying to follow the voice of the elders back then and the direction they gave us. That's what wakes me up in the morning. That's what has me energized to go into the hardest conversations of my life. And so, yeah, I think, us getting through that 20, I'm really mindful that I need to go in about 5 minutes. And so, yeah, I just want to say, the work ahead, and the fact that we've thrived in the last 20 years has a lot to do with the fact that we've followed that elder's voice, and we've worked really hard to bring in young Tlingits and young locals into the work. And that we have an executive director now, Amy Schmidt, who I knew her since she was in diapers. I used to go have visits with her parents, and I knew Amy and Anna all their life, and so those two local young women have been fundamental in being able to carry the voice of the Tlingits forward because they grew up among us, and Amy's dedication to investing in and recruiting and bringing on younger Tlingit people has been, in the last 5 years, we've experienced a lot more success there, and I know that carrying through with the Tlingit voice means we have to nurture and develop strong Tlingit voices, to keep going. And so that's really the focus of TAC's energy now is how do we nurture those people to be the voice of TAC and to be the voice of the Tlingits in all these different meeting rooms that we need to go to. And I just feel grateful to know that the partnership is getting stronger. Each year, each project, each new tool or map that we develop to support the Tlingits to represent themselves, that's what this is all about. When the Tlingits started the Indigenous Protected and Conserved Area work, it was to expand the Tlatsini vision. That was the direction we were getting. They weren't saying, oh, we tried to protect too much. They said, no, we need to protect more. Sue, you did a good job last time around, but not even close. Like there's way more land that needs to be protected. And so being involved in the Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas work has provided a really solid opportunity for the Tlingits to be able to come out and be really clear. If this is the Taku River watershed, we'd probably protected about this much of it in previous negotiations. And the Tlingits are saying, no, it's all of it. You missed the mark, and figuring out how to do and be a sustainable economy has also is coming as a stronger focus in the community. And so the conservation voice needs to realize that and respond to that. And we're still floundering a little bit about that.
So I know you're short on time, but I wonder, can I sneak in a question about the Salmon Resiliency Project and what your thoughts are on that?
For sure. But I think Dennis had something to say. Let's do that.
I just wanted to bring up a point on the area around traditional ecological knowledge. I think that the work with the T'akhu River Tlingit was the very first that I know of that really put that together as an example for negotiations with government. And it went through the court system. And the different caribou mapping that was done was actually went to the top whereby now government has to acknowledge that traditional knowledge is on par with, quote, Western science. When we started, there was so little work that had been done in that area, science-wise, that I was like, we didn't call it traditional knowledge. It was like, well, let's ask that old hunter over there where the hell the moose are, And we'd go to Uncle Willie and say, Uncle Willie, where are the moose? And he'd say, well, I ain't telling you. Why would I tell you? And he's, well, no, Uncle Willie. Maybe just describe, so what does it look like, in October? Or what does it look like in May? What does it look like in all these different moose, all these different months where you find moose? And where his descriptions, we turned that into, quote, computer models for habitat and describe what was on the land. But then when it went to the community, as Sue was saying, it wasn't the conservation science maps that was on the wall. It was Uncle Willie's moose map that was on the wall. So that was what was powerful as far as getting any work done. But anyway, I just had to put that out there because that was a major shift in how things were done, I think, across, all of Canada, really. And now in the U.S. as well, finally.
Well, Sue, before you head off, just let me say thank you for coming on the podcast today. I'll sneak in a few more questions with Dennis if he doesn't mind, but I really appreciate meeting you, and maybe we'll cross paths again in the future, but certainly grateful for the powerful stories that you shared and just truly grateful. Thank you for this.
Awesome. And yeah, if you do have any follow-up questions, know that I'm happy to book something else if we need to, but I hope that you guys, I'm just going to trust that you'll do. I hope I didn't cuss or anything while I was talking, but please take those out. If I did, I was really being focused not to cuss today. Yeah, and thank you so much for the opportunity. It's really good to see you, Carrie.
Take care.
Oh, Sue.
I love you, Dennis.
I wish you didn't tell us to take out the cussing.
See you guys later.
Bye-bye.
Here. Dennis, you must see all of this time now in hindsight as a privilege to you. Like, not very often in people's careers you get an experience like that. When you look at reflect on the whole experience over the past 20 years with the Conservancy.
Oh, yeah. It's exactly what you're saying. Yeah, we don't often get that kind of consistency or growth. I mean, it's just indeed starting there. My wife and I were invited to come up to Atlén we were in a meeting down around the Great Barrier Rainforest work. We were invited to come up there, and right before we were supposed to come, there was a suicide in the community, which unfortunately was not that uncommon. And it was in February. And I called and I said, maybe we should wait. And they said, no, this is actually the perfect time. This is good. Come. And so we were met at the Whitehorse Airport and driven down right into where, they were having a smokers gathering, for the individual who was pretty much known for his comedic. He was just a fun fellow, as people described it to me. But we were thrown right into the middle of the Wolf and Crow clan gathering about the individual. And the community there, they wanted to do everything as in the old ways as much as possible. And they were struggling to find what those ways were and to remember what they were. And I remember they were talking about, so we had to be in different clans, my wife and I. So she got put in the Crow clan, in the Wolf clan, and I got put in the Crow clan, and we had different duties to do over the next, several days. But during that experience, we met the whole community. And it really defined, I think it was looking back on the 20 years, it really assisted in so many ways because we met people on a different way. Normally, when a conservation organization comes into a place, it's in a dry kind of meeting and you're talking about what you want to do and what they want to do. But this was right on the basis of being people and mourning and having grief, and really at the foundation of what this community was really seeking, which was health of themselves, health of their land, and just help. And I think that really looking back, I think that was just so important with defining how we proceeded from there on. We had that kind of foundation, and all the work since then has really been kind of based on that foundation of just being with people, talking about things. It comes up in almost every meeting as far as this is all about, this is trail, this is memory, and I mean, all my work since has really been about, what I've learned with the T'akhu Â Tlén, just about how to do community work. How do you actually get involved and listen? And it really is about listening. And the T'akhu Â Tlén Conservancy is different in that it is a unusual. It's a blend of basically some white folks and some Tlingit. And how does that work? And it was really kind of how it was formed was really forced on by the foundations. About they wanted assurance about how it was going to be run and how their money was going to be spent. It was not. We did not propose any of this. It was imposed, really, that that there was a trust issue. But looking now, everything has shifted. The whole kind of spectrum has gone from we don't trust you at all to everything now has to be, so much now is like everything has to be completely Indigenous controlled with no white folks involved. And you go back and forth with this whole kind of spectrum. Well, actually, the Taku River Conservancy is in the middle. It works because there is a balance of voices. And I don't care if they're voices that are Indigenous or not, or white or not. I think it just has to be voices. I think we've gotten too concerned about the colors of people's skin rather than what they actually know and what they can actually bring to making decisions. And I think the Conservancy it's for whatever reason we get along, just basically acknowledging each other's experience and knowledge. And I wish we could kind of do that a lot of other places as far as just kind of listening to what can help the most and what can do the most. But yeah, it indeed has been the biggest pleasure of my life to be associated. And I use it, I'm trying to do the same thing now, 5,500 miles away. And there are more similarities than there are differences with working with tribal people in Southern Africa or where there are those similarities.
A lot of what you're saying there, Dennis, I can't help but think about the world has become so polarized in a lot of spheres now. And I just kind of wondering what your outlook is now for the next 20 years for TAC. And do you see challenges on the horizon, or do you have hope for what's to come? I'm curious to get your thoughts on what you see in the years ahead.
Of course, I mean, again, there's ebb and flows. It'll evolve. There will be challenges. I mean, with any small community where everybody not only knows each other, but is probably related, that there will be issues. There's going to be family and, whatever kind of stuff going on. And the smaller community, the more they're involved. And, it's the challenge, but it's also the reckoning of when anything happens. It's where those communities come together with such enormous love as well. So it's the balance of that kind of thing. As Auntie Antonio told me in that original meeting with the old elder women, a decision against the land the elders will never make. And I still have faith in that. I think what I've learned so much, with working with the Conservancy is that some things that a lot of the foundations that we dealt with as far as bringing money to this whole thing, they would say, what does that have to do with conservation? And what does having a language center, learning language, have to do with conserving grizzly bears or salmon? Actually, a great deal. And we're actually pointing to that's actually coming out now. And I think the more kind of community things we can do that point to those kind of things is what I think the next 20 years is about. It's getting some of the young people that first walked the Nakano Trail with us 25 years ago are people now that are assuming responsibility within the community. And I think those little bitty things, what seemed little bitty then, are really the major kind of things. So I think over the next 20 years, I think learning where indeed money should go into. It's probably not about salmon resilience. Salmon can take care of themselves if we just give them some space. And what are the most important things we can be doing with the people and their health? I mentioned the suicide. That continued, but it's less now. And it's getting lesser. Let's somehow make sure that continues and goes to zero. So young people are killing themselves. I think that's that kind of health. And what does that have to do with conservation? I think those are the kind of questions that we need to kind of start looking at as these kinds of organizations, broadening our scope to really looking at what we should be dealing with. It's not doing genetic analysis of grizzly bear hairs, which is what we funded as well. But it is about language. It is about health of the community. And have to say, yeah, I really love the grizzly bear, so we have to do some of that too. But the bigger stuff is about, indeed what that community is experiencing, because that healthy community, again, going back to Auntie Antonio, if there's a healthy elder environment, the land will remain healthy. So how do we do that? And I think that's kind of the next 20-year questions. How's that for long-winded?
No, I think that was beautiful. I'm so grateful that you made the connection with public health and human health and Indigenous health and how all that relates to conservation. And that's something that I actually care a lot about as well, Dennis. And I just want to end off today by thanking you for making this time. And I'm really grateful that we met, and hopefully we'll see each other again somewhere, and this won't be our first and last time. And also want to wish you luck on the work that you're doing in Botswana. No, and thank you. We really appreciate the efforts, and happy that we got to have this meeting today. Really appreciative. And you take care.
Okay, y'all. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the full podcast. Please like the podcast, subscribe, and leave comments so we can connect. If you are interested in joining a dedicated Indigenous community of practice with many of Canada's leading practitioners and thinkers in this area, you can skip over and visit our website at www.co-management.ca. Getting signed up is easy, and professional development is a tangible and effective way to show your commitment to reconciliation.